Today I'm speaking with Dan Kurzrock. Dan Kurzrock is the co-founder and chief grain officer of Upcycled Foods, where he's working to turn food waste into valuable new ingredients. Dan is passionate about building a more sustainable circular food system and is founding member of the Upcycled Foods Association and Upcycled Food Foundation. Through Upcycled Foods, Dan has helped develop patented technology that transforms food byproducts into high-quality ingredients, working closely with manufacturers to help reduce waste. His work has earned recognition from Forbes 30 Under 30 in food and beverage, among other industry honors, and he's a frequent speaker at events like Natural Products Expo, Green Biz Circularity, and the Refed Food Waste Summit. Dan has a BA from UCLA, so he's Californian, and he's got an MBA in sustainable business from the Presidio Graduate School. So we're really looking forward to talking to him. He's got some cool stuff that he's doing in breweries, yeast, and other products, and you hope you enjoy the session. Okay, so today I have Dan Kurzrock, who's the co-founder and chief grain officer of Upcycled Foods. Dan, great to have you here. Thanks for coming, and looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Daniel. Great to be with you.
Great. So why don't we just start out? Tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got to be doing what you're doing now, and then we'll get into what Upcycle does.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I would say identify as an entrepreneur. I came up with an idea back when I was an undergrad, actually, that has evolved over the years, and it's still something that I am passionately pursuing. I got started making beer as an underage college student at UCLA back in 2008, 2009 was the first batch, and loved the hobby. Definitely loved the loophole that it represented as well, if I'm being honest. But it was just wonderful, like making something from scratch. It was fascinating to me and fun, but also pretty mind blowing that every time I made a batch of beer, I had a bunch of grain left over. It felt like I was making a big batch of oatmeal or porridge, that was just getting tossed. And I grew up in Northern California, where we have vegetable gardens and municipal compost, and I was in a more urban environment for my undergrad, where all we had was a single dumpster bin to put this stuff. So it felt like every time I was making beer, which I loved, I was wasting food, which I hated. I didn't even know about food waste on a global scale at the time. It just felt like a very intuitive problem that should be solved. And so I did a bit of research and learned that there's a pretty rich history of human consumption of the grain that's been used to brew beer. We've been brewing beer a very, very long time. There's recipes of bread made with brewers' grains from modern day Germany, dating back to the Middle Ages. There's evidence of baking with these grains in even ancient Mesopotamia. So it's not a new idea. But it was something that I wasn't seeing on the grocery store shelves and on restaurant menus and the like. And it started making bread actually with it and selling the bread to friends to brew for free and asking bigger and bigger questions. And one thing led to another, as they say. We can get into all the details of that, but the origin was just some recreational entrepreneurship born out of a hobby for making beer as an undergraduate many moons ago now.
That's awesome. I have to ask, do you still make beer? Did you ever sell it, or did you just drink it? Hopefully safely drinking it.
Gosh, it would have been illegal to sell beer, man. Why would I do that? No, never. That was just I wasn't consuming it either. It was just making it, right? But I'm not making beer as often as I was. I was making it about once a week for a while. And then once we got going with the business and we started working with commercial breweries, initially smaller craft breweries, larger, and I make beer maybe once a year now. I make bread almost every week, actually. A little more immediately rewarding on that. Have you ever made beer before?
No, I mean, I guess I've toyed with it, but I always felt like the output would be inferior to what I could buy in the store. But yeah, there's lots of different hobbies I'd like to try when I'm older and I have more time. But no, I haven't been able to.
It can get quite fancy with it, but it's surprisingly simple. I mean, there's only 4 ingredients in beer making, at least traditional beer making. Just water, barley, hops, and yeast. And then the most important ingredient is time. And it's mostly time between steps, not time where you're actively doing anything. And it's a really wonderful craft. And but yeah, I'm not making beer myself as often. The original business idea though was a brewery bakery. I wanted to have like an integrated closed loop system. which
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe in my retirement, that'll be how I keep myself busy.
So I mean, we'll get into it more, but I'm interested because I've never brewed beer, and I think I imagine a lot of people that might listen to this would probably also not have brewed beer. I've toured breweries, but I've
Mm-hmm.
never thought about like what you're describing, this kind of what I'm imagining is kind of like a sludge, wet grain that comes out of it. Can you describe that and what it looks like or what it is, and how is it different from the grain that goes in or grain that you might normally use in baking?
Yeah, so the grain that is used to brew beer by and large is is barley. You can also make beer with wheat, with rye. A lot of the kind of cheaper beers are made with corn, and those are called adjuncts. And the barley, after it's harvested from the field and and cleaned and such to make malt, it's basically a sprouting process. So malt is, you can think of it as sprouted barley. And barley is one of the oldest cultivated crops known to humanity, as well. We've been making it a very, very long time. And then that malt, after it's been effectively sprouted, so it kind of soaked, and then the end of the ferm comes out, and there's some science going on there that we don't have to get into details of. But the malt itself is then basically roast. You can think of it like roasting. And so there's different types of malt that are there's different types of barley, 2-row barley, 6-row barley, things like that. But more important to the flavor development is how that barley is then effectively roasted. After that process, that's what we get when you drink a dark beer. It's think of it like a darker roasted coffee relative to a lighter beer.
Okay.
And in beer making, what you're doing is you're taking that sprouted grain, and the brewers do a very rough mill of it, basically effectively just cracking the grain. So it's not like a flour. This very much
Mm,
looks like a whole grain, um, that you would see if you picture like a bag of rolled oats, or something like that. It's not exactly that shape, but you could think of like that kind of particle size, right?
mm,
And then hot water is mixed
okay.
with it. And there's automated mechanical ways that happens at a larger scale, or when you're making beer at home, you're literally heating water over a stove and pouring it into these grains and stirring it in. And there's a soaking process that then happens. And
Mm,
after that soaking process, there's basically a draining and rinsing process where you're taking this like sugary liquid that's called wort from the
mm,
from the barley. And that
mm,
is the color of beer. It doesn't taste like beer. It's very sweet. And that sweetness is the sugars that have been extracted from the malt, that when you introduce yeast later on in the process, the yeast is then consuming the sugar, and through that's fermentation, right? So it's producing alcohol as a byproduct of that, as well as carbon dioxide, which is where you get carbonation in that from
mm.
like a naturally carbonated beer. So it really just, it looks like porridge. When you're done with it, it's just wet. It's not a sludge at all. It's like wet whole grains that
Uh-huh.
are quite unstable because of the moisture content. About 90% moisture, like soaking wet and hot.
So that comes out of the first part of the process before you even start fermenting, that you're kind of
Yeah, and
done with the
before
grain at
hops are
that point.
introduced,
Yeah.
it's all,
Yeah.
yeah, it's all like, up front. And
Yeah.
you're not alone, and having not really considered this side stream, really, that comes from the beer brewing process. And it's true of what we've learned over the years, is that this is a pattern with a lot of other food products, that
Mm,
are the food and beverage products that are made, whether it's a plant-based milk, or if you've ever been to the store and purchased whey protein, for example, that's actually made through the process of cheese making. So this is
mm,
not there's a lot of foods that are interconnected, but there's also a lot of foods that are being left off the table. And as a company, our mission is effectively to identify the most nutritious, flavorful, functional uh, food ingredients that are being left off the table today, and then closing the loop on those. And I can give more examples beyond brewer's grain. But that's really where we got started and what we're
yeah.
doing commercially, at the largest volumes today.
Okay. And we'll get into that. So what do you do then with the grain afterward? You dry it out and then you mill it into flour. And how does that differ? Are you selling that then as just a normal flour? And how does that behave differently than like regular flour that people would buy? Right.
Yeah, great question. I mean, there's at a high level, you're basically right. It's a stabilization. Then there's a drying process, and then there's a milling process to reduce the particle size, make it like a powder, which is like a flour. We don't often talk about it as a flour, though, because the second part of your question, it doesn't functionally perform like a flour, because there's not, in dough, you need the gluten from the grain to, to form a dough, right? And the barley that goes into brewing is very low gluten to begin with, and effectively all that gluten is extracted in the brewing process. So there's quite a bit of protein, quite a bit of fiber, but no functional gluten. So if you're a baker, that's working with this ingredient, which to answer the last part of your question, we're currently selling it wholesale, in 25, 50-pound bags, to commercial bakeries, snack companies, grain-based foods. It's used as a fortifying inclusion. So companies will use it at up to 25, 30% of the flour weight, maybe, or some, if you think of it a little differently, depending on if it's not like a dough-based, yeast risen dough product, it's more like anywhere from 10 to 30% of the dry weight, of a product. This can be incorporated, and it will introduce fiber, it'll introduce protein, it introduces some nice, kind of toasty, nutty flavor to it. Pairs really well with sourdough, by the way. And that also, of course, has these sustainability benefits, which are really why we started the company to begin with.
Okay. Yeah, it's fantastic. As you were talking about this, in in the German language, they have a term for this type of approach where you're trying to use byproducts and side streams and use them for something functional. It's called a Produktverbund, which basically is this idea that every thing that comes out of a process can be used in another process. And actually, when they make chemicals, a lot of this happens. Like, when you just certain chemicals have other byproducts that can be used in other processes, so there'd be no sense in throwing them away. You can then use them.
I mean, so if you look at like paper production commercially, for example, too, right? There's chemicals as a co-product, and there's like, this idea. I mean, you could look at natural systems too, and draw inspiration from that. In nature, there is no waste. And the thing is, just as a food system, as we've gotten more and more efficient, at improving, throughput, for example, of different processes and distribution and the like. We've also created this, this kind of missed opportunity of waste, and it's at that, it's common sense, but it's not, for various reasons that we can also get into. It's not always put into practice as you would logically expect it to.
Yeah, I would imagine, like in beer brewing, that at some stage the beer companies just decide, I'm selling beer, I'm going to make my beer, and I don't care about what else happens. I'm focusing on making beer. And so then, particularly if folks have a wasteful mindset, which, historically, I think no one thought about this stuff, right? Like if you're in the 1800s, the population wasn't so big, so maybe they didn't care as much.
Well, the other thing, Daniel, is that, like, I like to be very clear that breweries are not being wasteful necessarily, right? It's, you can't make beer without also making this grain. And to your point, their core business is making beer, and the most common thing to do with this so-called spent grain from the breweries is to send it off for animal feed, because there's it's kind of the path of least resistance in most places. In some parts of the world, it's sent to landfill, which is terrible, in that case, because then you're also producing methane from that breaking down in that environment, which creates all kinds of environmental issues. Some places it's incinerated, but by and large, about 80%, in the U.S., for example, goes to industrial animal feed uses, and that's the path of least resistance. But what we argue is that that's not the path of highest value. There's a lot of nutrition and flavor and functionality in this material, and we're fine with a hierarchy of uses, but it should start with feeding nutritious food to people, and then finding other uses from there.
Right, makes sense. So before we get into the business model and your other products, you mentioned you have other products. I'm interested to hear about that. You have some IP on this process also. So can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, getting IP of any sort is always usually a big milestone, I think, when you determine that there's something unique enough what you're doing that can be patented. How did you get to that point, and how have you leveraged that? And what is it that your IP is doing?
Yeah, so this connects back to one of your other questions about the composition of this material after it's been used to brew, and what needs to happen in order to make it into a viable ingredient for more food production. Because of how wet the material is, and it's about 80-90% moisture depending on the brewery. You can think of it as like the shelf life, of this when it's fresh from the brewery is incredibly short. We're talking hours, not days, unless there's an intervention step that happens. And so if you go back to the early days where we were making bread and selling it to friends and buying more ingredients to brew more beer and starting to dream up a bigger business, one of the early hurdles that we identified was how do we process this material in a way that's scalable, because there's enormous volumes of it. That's the other thing, Daniel. It's about 1 pound for every 6 pack of beer. So a single brewery.
Transportation cost is probably heavy too if it's
Yeah, you don't want
already
to be
wet,
moving this stuff.
right?
It's wet, it's
Yeah,
heavy,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it's unstable. And like even a small brewery, which is what we were working with to begin with, like,
Mhm.
the brewery that's not even distributing their beer to retailers, maybe they have a couple taps around town, but it's mostly, on-site consumption. And even a place like that in a single day could generate 2,000 pounds of fresh brewer's grain from the process.
Mhm.
And so we realized pretty quickly that the process that we were doing at a small scale, which was effectively oven drying the material, on sheet pans, slow and low, and turning it, and it worked and it was safe, but it was not scalable. We had to figure out how to do this in a more meaningful way.
Mhm.
And fortunately, I was tipped off to the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Research Service group, which has a research center in nearby to where we are in Albany, California, which is basically Berkeley, right across the bay from San Francisco. And they had a research directive around creating novel ingredients out of plant-based waste, which is quite literally what we're doing. And so wrote the USDA a couple cold emails, and we were invited in for a meeting and aligned on something called a CRADA, Collaborative Research and Development Agreement, where we worked with this team of scientists at the USDA to figure out the best way to process the material. And that ended up resulting in some IP, because nothing off the shelf was suitable.
Right. And so I would imagine there's still quite a bit of energy involved in drying anything that at that speed. So how does it work? What is your process then? Maybe describe the value chain, or like comes out of the brewery that you're working with, and do you have to take it and transport it? Do you attach some equipment there at the brewery? Like how does
Yeah.
that work?
The system's designed to be deployed on site. It can also be, and the way we've operationalized it, so far has been more of like a hub and spoke, close by to breweries. There's not over 9,000 breweries in operation in the US.
Mhm.
San Francisco, where we started, there's literally more breweries than neighborhoods. It's pretty insane. The system, I mean, anyone can look up our patent, issued patent. It's an infrared based
Okay.
processing method. Infrared's quite energy efficient. It can run either on electricity or natural gas. And there's some mechanical stirring involved in that, and it's not rocket science, but it is food science, and it was novel
Mhm.
enough to result in a patent.
Yeah, it's awesome. Oh, great. So like tell us about how do you make the business run? You're talking a little bit about operationalizing it. I mean, clearly there's costs of, getting the equipment running. You've got to build a relationship with the brewer. That's got to work out and not be difficult for them, et cetera, et cetera. And then you've got to then go to market and get the
Mm-hmm.
product in front of, well, said you're selling wholesale. So it sounds like you're not dealing with retailers yet, but,
So
how does that work?
yeah, I mean, so we're a business to business company. We do engage with retailers, but in a business to business capacity. Just starting at a high level, like our two revenue streams as a company today. One is ingredient sales, which I'll
Mhm.
break down in a second, and then the other is innovation partnerships, which is effectively services through our Upcycled Foods
Mhm.
lab. So we have the upcycled ingredients, and then we have the Upcycled Foods lab. On the upcycled ingredient side, there's now array of ingredients that are made from the brewer's grain. We call that Regrain Supergrain Plus. That was the original name of the
Mhm.
company, was Regrain. We still often do business as Regrains, elevating the spent grain to a super grain, right? And there's the classic powder product that we spent some time talking about, but also what we'd call value added formats. So things like blends with sourdough and clean label enzymes for bakers to be able to just incorporate this more easily into their product. Did that one with a company called Puratos. There's crisps, which are basically like little expanded and kind of like breakfast cereal pieces, right? But you can find them in like a nutrition bar.
Mhm.
There's a lot that we can do with that one material, and then and those ingredients are used primarily for new product development opportunities. So companies that are making a new super grain, bread, for example. And we've had national retailers like Kroger, Misfits Market commercialize products, using this ingredient. In the early days, we actually made our own products, and we don't do that anymore. So we had our own consumer packaged goods, aspect of our business model, which was the early days of proving what was possible.
I think it makes sense to do it at the start, because otherwise, you don't get any product out there. But I think building a product business involves a lot of other marketing and branding and other things like that that are very expensive.
Absolutely, and we could probably have a whole podcast episode about that alone.
Yeah.
But kind of just an anecdote I could share is, one of the first products we made and actually got distributed nationally at one point into retail was a nutrition bar. Now we have a customer that's making nutrition bars, right?
Of course, yeah.
Would one have been possible without the other? When in the early days of creating a market, right? It's hard to say. So that was something we did in the early days, but our model has shifted to this, primarily focusing on ingredient sales and working often in a triangle with someone like a brand, which could include like a retailer's private label group, and then the network, a network of contract manufacturers actually produce the products for most of the brands that end up on the store. And we're often working with the brand on, what's possible, what types of new products they could make, what types of claims, what types of stories, but then ultimately our transaction, is happening with the manufacturer, who's purchasing the ingredient in order to, along with the other ingredients that are needed to make the finished good. And we have kind of two buckets of ingredients. One is like the regrained, where it's new product development, and then the other is where we're using the same principles of upcycling, but to focusing more on developing functional alternatives to at-risk commodities, things like cocoa powder, for example, where it's more of a substitution play as opposed to a net new product development play. And then connecting that through to the services model, which is a more recent offering. We've developed a lot of subject matter expertise around, what can be done with some of these materials, and then the connecting the dots between what can be done and what should be done. And we're working with different organizations and groups like commodities boards and food processors, food brands around evaluating potential upcycling opportunities internally and in helping unlock that. And that's not only something that's a nice way for us to collaborate with different stakeholders around new opportunities that we may want to commercialize in the ingredients business, but it's also a different sales cycle. The ingredients as a business is quite difficult for startups because it can take 18, 24 months for a new product to launch from when it's introduced. It's
Yeah,
quite
but once you're feeding an ingredient into a food product that is successful, then of course it layers on top of itself. I think the food ingredient
it becomes more like a SaaS business model, right?
It's one of the greatest business models in the world. But you're right, it takes a lot of startup kind of, I think, energy and patience. And then you really do need to add value. I mean, what you're describing is kind of like value added ingredients, where it sounds like you're helping with formulation and innovation, and you have to know your ingredient the best and help your customer integrate that and figure out how it works in a substitution and prove that it does work. Because a lot of times brands, even very big brands, they don't have the capacity to do that. Like they might not even have a pilot plant that has capacity, because all the manufacturing capacity they have is going into making their core product. That's how they make money. So I think that we see a lot of this in the ingredient industry. When we do work with ingredient companies as well, and that more and more that kind of value added service goes into how can they help make what would otherwise be a potential commodity more usable and more valuable, because there's a learning process involved in how to use it. Right.
So, yeah, and I would argue that a lot of, and you probably see this in your work too, Daniel, that the ingredient companies are often the ones pushing the innovation agenda within the industry, because the contract manufacturers are often, all they have capacity to do a lot of times is respond to the interest that's already ready for commercial activity from the brands. And the brand, depending on what's going on, they may be focused on solving for some crisis that's what exists with an existing product,
distribution, pricing,
all
packaging,
all
those
the other things. And so if we can help activate the opportunity, it's good for everyone. But without that kind of activating both that push and pull side, the pull from the brand and the push from the manufacturer, which takes a lot of groundwork to be able to do that. And then it can be quite huge once these products get commercialized, right? But that's why you see a lot of innovation being pushed by these ingredient companies, because someone's got to connect the dots.
Yeah, they also need to stay relevant. I think it is a smart way to distribute the industry responsibilities, if you will, also because innovation requires usually like pretty good scientific knowledge and research scientists, and there aren't so many of those out there, right? Like, I mean, the university system doesn't really produce tons and tons of people with those capabilities. So having them sort of concentrated in the supply side, then you can help more companies in a way, right? So it's actually
Mm-hmm.
kind of an efficient way to think about it.
Yeah.
You mentioned other products other than the grains. Are you working on doing like the same concept with other types of byproducts from other processes, or what would be
Yeah.
other products that you could develop?
Yeah, there's so many potential ingredients, out there. And what we've started to do, we develop some ourselves, and then we also partner with companies that have interesting technology and supply chains that we think solve
Mm.
needs for our customers. So, there's kind of group them by different supply streams. So if we think about cacao is a really interesting one, right? Which hopefully most, I would assume, listeners of this podcast, are aware that, like, it's the cacao is what gets turned into chocolate, right?
Mm.
But cacao is a fruit, and that fruit has flesh, and it has a like a husk, effectively around it. And there's two ingredients that we're offering that are really interesting. One is a syrup that's made from the fruit from the cacao, which has
Mhm.
been commercialized in a variety of products. One is bitters, as an example, right? So it's got to bring some really interesting flavor. Um,
Mhm.
the soda, is another one, and then the cacao husk, makes for a really interesting tea. It's got some theobromine, which is performs like caffeine. It's got some great kind of dark chocolatey, flavor, and makes for a really interesting, kind of tea and coffee, alternative. Um, Turning to coffee, coffee, we're actually producing coffee from the pit effectively of a fruit, right? The coffee bean
Mhm.
is grows inside of a cherry. That coffee fruit has some really interesting properties. We're not actually, commercially selling the coffee fruit products. There are some companies that are doing that. It's also called Kafkara. But we've got a really interesting product that's made from the leaves of the coffee plant from prunings. Love this one too because it generates year-round revenue for coffee farmers who otherwise only are able to generate revenue for about a third of the year. And the leaves from the coffee plant, I've actually got some coffee leaf tea sitting next to me, right now. It's a really nice tea product with there's almost no tannin, so it's got a very smooth flavor that doesn't require much sweetness, added to it, and it's got more antioxidants on a gram per gram basis compared to matcha, for
Mhm.
example. So there's health benefits too. Um, if you look at wine production, there's grapes that are unusable in wine making. And there's an innovator that we've partnered with that's making a really interesting raisin-like product made from
Mhm.
wine grapes, and also from post-pressing of wine. There's a pomace that's left over from that, like a pulp. And
Mhm.
working with another company that's developed some interesting, think of them like purees made from these wine pomace that can help with actually quite a number of ways, particularly in like liquid systems like sauces, where it can improve flavor and also help save cost and some other ingredients because of the attributes of the wine pomace. It really it can positively impact from like a flavor formulation standpoint, which I know for you in particular
Mhm.
might be kind of interesting. So I could give more examples, but those are just some. We're looking at all over the world really for where there's ingredient opportunities that are being left off the table.
So yeah, so it sounds like basically your model is to search for existing processes where there's value to be had in this, to use this word, product for boon sort of opportunity set,
Mm-hmm.
where you can take that and partner with someone who doesn't have otherwise a use for that, rather than going straight to the source of, like, you're not producing a new full value chain. You're basically working off side streams specifically, which there might be an interesting economic view of that. I mean, I am actually curious. So when you let's take the grain example again, because maybe it's the simplest one. When you're getting this raw ingredient from the brewers and then you convert it into this product, does that mean that when your customer uses it in their product, that they're actually able to reduce their overall ingredient costs, or is there some economic benefit from it, or is it really just rather than throwing it away, you use it for something higher good. Like, is there some sort of margin that
Yeah,
that
like, are
you're
we
risking?
relying on, I mean, are you basically asking, are we like
Yeah,
relying on virtue, to move
yeah.
the products
Well,
forward?
but I think, I mean, everything, there'll be adoption, more or faster adoption, if your customers are like, oh yeah, this is great, and actually I can save money on my ingredient costs, because food producers
Yeah,
are always trying to reduce their cost of their inputs, obviously, right?
right.
So
Right,
yeah,
and
yeah,
that's kind of the holy grail in ingredients, right? Is cheaper,
yeah,
better,
yeah.
and it's absolutely possible at scale, particularly for that second bucket of ingredients around functional substitutes.
Right.
The brewer's brand product is really more like looking at the early days of developing the market for quinoa, for example, where it's a new ingredient to most people. It's got new attributes, new flavor, and it's more for new product development. So it's not the sale is not so much into existing products for reformulation, but more about new products. But
Mm,
it is a very cost-effective source of the benefits, that are in there, whether it's, talking about prebiotic fiber or lowering net carbs or introducing, plant protein. It has all the sustainability benefits, but we like to try to think of those as a kind of a by the way, to the customer, where, what's going to actually drive most new product development is the value that is the differentiation power of the ingredient relative to
mm,
what else is out there. And so it's
yeah.
a little bit of both, and it's fairly nuanced depending on the particular ingredient, the particular application, and many of them certainly do often have that potential for cheaper, better. Some of them at current scale, others need to reach more economies of scale. And oftentimes I like to remind people of parallels with industries like energy, for example, with solar, and the cost of solar panels have gone down like something like 90% in the last decade, right? So
Yeah.
it's there's some of that kind of classic economics at play here too.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like you're also, though, you're generating a lot of trade secret and knowledge, which, when in an industry like this then starts to mature, you're in a good position. And let's talk about a little bit about that. Like, so how would you scale something like this? Like, I would presume that you said you need to work kind of locally. You're not going to take grain from, a brewer in California and end up having to sell the final product over in New York, I presume. And tell me if that's wrong. I would think that you need to have some localization around the food ecosystem that you're working within. And so you have to figure out a way to scale this knowledge, or franchise it or something like that. Like, what have you thought about how that might work?
Yeah, so I mean, your intuition is more or less aligned with our strategy at scale, right? Which is distributed infrastructure on site, where there's, you can think of like production hubs. Thing is that because if you look at the beer example, for example, there's the denominator of what's available for supply is so huge, even from a single region or from a single brewery, that requires a middle step during the market building of maybe a suboptimal scenario where you have product being shipped across the country. But if you think of our food system more generally, it's not very uncommon, right, for
Mm,
you to source ingredients from other states or other countries even. So the infrastructure exists for that distribution, and that's what's required to get to scale. Because it doesn't make sense for from like a capital expenditure standpoint, right, to deploy the capability to add capacity in a region unless there's so much demand in that region at that point that there's actually that benefit of having that located there. And so at
right.
scale, there's things like licensing models that we're looking at different types of joint ventures and partnership models. But in the early commercialization side of things, which is where we are now, we have commercialized technology, commercialized product, commercial customers, with sales scaling. We don't need a manufacturing facility in every city in the in the country. You can produce a staggering amount of material even just from one manufacturing site.
Right. Okay. That sounds interesting. Um, so what's been tough? You're an entrepreneur. Sounds like you've got things going here. You're selling, you're moving, you got customers. What's been maybe the hardest thing or the biggest lesson so far? And what do you think some of the biggest hurdles to your business and the general, this kind of like side stream industry, are in terms of growth and adoption?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, what hasn't been tough, right? It's probably an answer
Well,
you get
yeah,
from a lot
I
of
always think though, like,
entrepreneurs.
hard
Yeah,
things don't seem hard in hindsight, right? Like, hard things only seem hard like right at the moment you're doing them. You know?
Yeah,
So
and it's doing the most entrepreneurs like doing hard things, right? Just as a personality trait, and
yeah.
I'm certainly one of those people. So I mean, you could kind of pick your category for a challenge that we could pick on. I mean, I'd say most acute probably in the last couple of years has been the funding environment and in the food industry. There was a lot of money that flooded into plant-based meats and different alternative proteins and some spectacular implosions that happened there that destroyed a lot of value for a lot of investors. And there's also just a larger kind of global, macroeconomic trends, that have been happening over the last couple of years. And, we're not we're not like a super, super well-funded startup. Yeah, I mean, we've been pretty responsible with how we raised capital over the years and done a lot with a little. But we hit a point a couple of years ago where we were ready to put some capital to work to reach the next phase and had a round all lined up. And the lead investor who had committed to the round, for various reasons related to what I was talking about, they were unable to actually close their fund,
Mm-hmm.
which then creates a whole cascade of challenges, right? So I mean, funding is always going to be top of mind probably for any CEO founder that you're speaking to. So that's one challenge. The other is, I mean, we spent a little bit of time talking about this, but maybe more interesting intellectually for like a podcast audience is just this challenge of building a market. So there's this market failure that is represented by food waste generally and by the aspect of food waste and food loss that we're tackling specifically, where there's so much latent supply of these materials that have really interesting attributes, and then latent demand from brands that are looking to create differentiated products and reach tap into consumer demand for healthier, better, more sustainable products. You kind of there's different focuses for different ones, right? But the market isn't actually making that connection themselves, and so we're simultaneously building capacity on the supply side, right? And developing the technology, developing the products, the know-how, how these materials can be used, and then also needing to build demand for the ingredient from the brand so they can understand what's possible with that, right? And that's systems level stuff, and it's quite challenging and takes a long time. It's definitely an endurance sport, and we're well on our way, much further along than we were when we started. But there's definitely still a big hill to climb. It's this is a long-term play here.
Yeah, I think that's one interesting thing about the food industry is that it doesn't shift as quickly as many entrepreneurs and investors would like it to, particularly tech. Like, for example, like the tech return profile is
Mm-hmm.
totally different. I think that played a lot into some of these blow-ups that you mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
It was just sort of a misalignment of expectation of what will happen, because ultimately you're dealing with people, and people's habits change slowly despite all the intellectual reasons why they should change habits. They usually don't, right? So you often have to kind of wait for generations to change in a lot of cases. But certainly, like, economics and efficiency is always a factor. Like, cost is always an issue in food. People need to eat. We have to do it, right? That's not going to stop. And so we're always going to be challenged by how do we provide more nourishment and calories to more people at a cost basis that we can sustain in a world where a lot of our other costs are also increasing at a rate where there are scarce resources like energy, right? And so I think that the food industry offers this sort of opportunity for an entrepreneur like yourself and for many others, that if you can find a value structure that makes sense and continue to provide like a way in which producers of food and sellers of food can do what they've been doing for a long time, because it's a proven there's a proven demand for what they're doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they can continue what they're doing, have been doing for a long time, better, more efficiently, more healthy, all of those things, even in small measure, and you can continue to innovate around that problem solving, then you're always going to have some interest of new customers coming along, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
that it's true about the food industry throughout history, right? Like, it's always adopted mechanization and efficiencies and cost savings and scale. I think the big distortion that happened is kind of like commercialization and processing of food. But now we're finding
Mm,
that actually not only is that not healthy, but in a lot of cases, like what you're describing, it's actually creating a waste which maybe previously we could tolerate and we could pay for, right, as a society
hmm.
and economically. But over time, we're going to find that actually that's a distortion and inefficiency that we just can't deal with anymore. We've got to fix it, right? And so all of these pressures kind of come, but they come slowly and it changes slowly. So you've got to sort of
Yeah,
pick your pacing, right? If it's a long-term game. It's a marathon, right? And if you
yep.
can run that marathon and you don't burn your energy too quickly, and you're right at the right pace, at the right place, at the right time, and you keep kind of being in that situation, I think over time you do generate like just long-term value, right?
Yeah, yeah. If you talk to any, I don't know if you've ever run a marathon or do any endurance sports yourself, but there's kind of
Yeah,
this mentality in that world of pain is mandatory, suffering is optional, right? And
yeah,
it's
yeah.
it is absolutely a long term thing. We've got customers that are commercializing now that we first met 5 or 6 years ago, in some
Yeah,
cases because we're
I
the
that
first to
doesn't
start talking
surprise me
about
at
this.
all.
It's
That
just
doesn't surprise me at all. Yeah.
it's just how it goes. But fundamentally, there's especially on like a human level, and as you so rightly put, it's humans that are running these companies. There's a much broader understanding that we have to improve the way we're producing food. Starting
Mm,
with healthy soil, healthy plants, healthy people, right? I guess talked about within like regenerative agriculture is the most common term for that right now. And all the way down to what are we doing with the food after we've already produced it, and we're trying to put it to its highest and best use to make sure that we're wasting less food, because if you look at like the brewer's grain, just on one resource input alone, water, there's for the 1 pound of grain that's used for 1 6-pack of beer, it's like something like a pilsner, it's approximately 330 gallons of water to produce that
mm,
malt. Like a 2 hour
mm.
shower, of water and
Yeah,
then barley is a pretty water efficient crop, too, by the way.
yeah,
So when we look at things like famously like almonds, use a lot of water. I'm based in California, right? And
yeah,
there's opportunities for ingredient innovation with some of the almonds, side streams, as well. And it's we come from the sensibility around reducing food loss and food waste as a company, and myself personally, but it's connected more generally to just having being more efficient with our resources, doing more with less, or as one close friend likes to tell me, doing more with more. And I like that mentality too. And if we're going to tap into abundance, this is a really powerful tool to do that.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's actually a couple companies I should introduce you to if you don't know them already. You can do that offline that are also in this side stream business. I mean, is there like a
Right.
trade association for this? Like, do
Yeah.
companies that are doing this have this kind of mission of figuring out how to
Yeah.
do this get together or what?
Yeah, so I mean, back in 18 or 19, 7 or 8 of us came together and formed a nonprofit called the Upcycled Food Association,
Hmm.
which is still around. And actually, we developed a certification, a price certification standard called Upcycled Certified that was acquired
Hmm.
by a group called Where Food Comes From. And so there's kind of a like set of standards that people are, and that's important for lots of reasons that are probably obvious to the audience here. I know you're over in Europe and probably have some European listeners. There's, for example, in the Netherlands, there's a group called Food Valley, that's kind of like a consortium that are bringing different groups together.
Hmm.
So I mean, there's a lot of it. I would love to. We always, I think, to a person, everyone that's in this aspect of doing some form of upcycling or another, we like connecting, with one another, because there's often ways to find a kind of confluence of interests and collaborate in a way that serves the mission and both companies, as opposed to a very kind of guarded competitive mindset that may happen at a larger scale down the road, but hopefully not. I mean, this is where we need all the solutions, and we need to work together, if we're going to try and fix something like our food system, which is to a person pretty much what all of us in this space want to be doing, why we answer the
Yeah,
bell every morning.
yeah, I think you're spot on. And then that's as you said, it's a long-term game, and you gotta just keep at it. But eventually the rock moves, right? You gotta put
Yeah.
your shoulder to the wheel and just keep pushing. And
Yeah, classic 20-year overnight success. That's what
yeah,
we're here for.
Yeah, well, if you can have one success in life, even if it takes you 20 years, that's a lot more. That's a lot more than a lot of people get, so
Yeah.
you should be happy about that. Uh, well, listen, it's been great talking. Super interesting stuff, and I'd love to continue following the types of things that you're doing. We'll put your website and all that stuff online, and otherwise, wish you the best, and hope to be in touch soon. Maybe we'll get out to San Francisco. I presume you go to
Yeah.
the events and things, the food innovation events that happen there. I've been a few times, but it's a
Yeah.
long trip. One of these years I'll go back. So
Yeah. That sounds great. Thanks so much for having me. Cheers.
great. Thank you, Dan. Take care.
Take care.